Rebecca Safran. I am a but I also am very interested in science communication, and along with one of our panelists, Dr. Leif Boven.
It's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses. We're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Just a reminder to please silence your phones. And we will get started. So just for the record and for the recording, today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. It is 9:30 a.m. in the Mountain Time Zone. And again, the name of the panel is Greenwashing, Can I Trust an Organization's Climate Claims? Before we get started, I've been asked to read a land acknowledgement for the University of Colorado. I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and the Ute. The other thing that I would like to mention is that we want to be sure that we get questions from our audience members, and this is how we will handle the Q&A. There's going to be some time reserved at the end for you to address the panel or somebody specific on the panel, and we're using a note card system to solicit questions. So simply raise your hand if you have a question in mind, and one of the producers will come over with a writing instrument and a note card. They'll collect those, they'll bring them to me, and we'll have some time at the end where I will read these questions. And there's a note for me to remind you to please make sure that your questions are brief and to the point. I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of our panelists, and then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves for about 2 minutes, and then we'll jump right into talking about the topic at hand. So first up is Dr. Carl Hausker, who received his BA in economics from Cornell University and holds a master's and a PhD in public policy from the University of California in Berkeley. He is a senior fellow in the climate program of the World Resources Institute, WRI, which is a global research nonprofit established in 1982 with funding from the MacArthur Foundation. So it's a very highly regarded think tank in Washington, D.C. And WRI's activities are focused on one of 7 areas: food, forests, water, energy, cities, climate, and ocean. At the WRI, Dr. Hausker leads analysis and modeling of deep decarbonization, climate mitigation, electricity market design, and the social cost of carbon. He testifies before Congress, lectures widely. I was looking at on the web last night, and it looks like you've been all over the world lecturing recently and during the pandemic online, and has led many studies of clean energy scenarios for the United States. So he's worked for 3 decades on the fields of climate change, energy, and environment. Next on our panel, we have Kirk Siegler, who graduated with a degree in broadcast journalism from right here, the University of Colorado in Boulder, as well as a minor in political science. Very cool integration. Kirk has been reporting for NPR since 2012, and he's currently a correspondent on NPR's national desk, where he covers rural life, culture, politics from his base in Boise, Idaho. Sounds also like you have a base in LA these days as well. And his stories are often focused on the intersections and divisions between urban and rural life, focusing on issues related to ranching, mining, fracking, the ski industry, climate-related disasters, including the mega fire in Paradise, California. Just yesterday, Kirk reported on the White House's plans to keep the two largest reservoirs in the West from falling too low by subdividing water rights, very incredibly contentious issue, and also reports on all sorts of issues related to lithium mining, the mega drought in Arizona, all the way to deforestation in the Amazon. Next, we have Professor Leif Van Boven, who has a BS in psychology from the University of Washington, a PhD in psychology from Cornell University. Leif is currently the chair of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience here at the University of Colorado. It's one of our largest departments, so that is no small feat to manage. He is the director of the Environment, Decision, Judgment, and Identity Lab, and is the co-director of the Center for Creative Climate Communication and Behavioral Change, which we refer to as C3BC. So Dr. Van Boven's work integrates social, environmental, and political psychology to study the interrelationship between emotion, judgment, decision-making, and identity. And he's interested in how behavioral scientists and psychologists can help people make better decisions and have a positive impact on a variety of different things related to economics, politics, and the environment. Recent publications include The Elite Influence on Public Attitudes about Climate Policy, and Social Norms Explain Prioritization of Climate Policy. Next, we have Mary Wenzel, who received a BA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University and her master's degree from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Mary is just made a recent move to the Nature Conservancy, where she is a managing director of corporate engagement. Prior to that, she worked for 17 years in sustainability at the Wells Fargo Bank, and has also worked at Enron and had several stints at the EPA. Let's see. Yeah, so Mary's work in both the public and private sector has been focused on the strategic integration of sustainability and corporate responsibility at large. Welcome, Mary. And finally, Jevin West, who is an associate professor in the Information School at the University of Washington. He received his bachelor's degree in biology at Utah State University, a PhD from the University of Washington in biology, and notably did a postdoc in Sweden in the ICE lab before joining the faculty at the University of Washington. He is currently an associate professor, and he co-founded the Center for an Informed Public. He studies the science of science and worries about the spread of misinformation. His lab literally consists of millions of scholarly papers and posts about science, where he developed algorithms and tools to better understand the evolution of science, the fate of ideas across time in various disciplines. His work is extremely interdisciplinary, spanning the fields of biology, computer science, sociology, and physics. His projects have ranged from tracking the birth and death of ideas using citation networks, gender bias in authorship and promotion, and he's recently co-authored a very popular book, Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. So if you would all please introduce yourselves in your own words in about 2 to 3 minutes, that would be great, and then we'll get started with questions.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll just do a couple stage-setting remarks on the question of, can we trust companies' claims on climate change? And I think there's sort of a bad news, good news story here about the past, and then where I hopefully where we're going now and in the future. There have been a lot of claims over the last 2 decades of companies saying, we are powered by renewables, or we have offset our CO2 emissions by paying someone else to do something. And there has been a lot of lack of integrity in these claims, although some companies have really accomplished something. In the case of renewable energy, the companies that really did something may have put solar cells, on the roofs of their factories or their office buildings and really spurred new renewable energy. At the other end of the spectrum, there's kind of a racket where companies would buy something called renewable energy certificates for a plant that had already been built, and there's this sort of this system of RECs, renewable energy certificates, but if I bought one, for a plant in Oklahoma, does that really mean my factory in Georgia is powered by renewables? Not so much. On the issue of offsets, often what would happen, particularly going way back to the 1990s, companies would say, it's too expensive for me to reduce emissions, but tree planting, that's really cheap. I can get CO2, pulled out of the atmosphere for $1 a ton, so I'm going to plant a bunch of trees. Or I'm going to pay someone not to cut down their forest. Well, again, sometimes there were real things that happened, real trees planted in areas that would not otherwise be pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in other cases, there was pretty fraudulent stuff, lack of integrity, and also really tough to manage problems. Like if I really did protect this area of rainforest, maybe just this other part that's not protected is going to get cut down. That's called leakage. Anyway, so that's the bad news. Yes, and we've had a lot of that going on. But there are serious movements going forward now that we should all pay attention to and we should all support. For one thing, a lot of companies are really getting it that we are in a serious crisis. We can no longer say like, well, let's do the cheap stuff first and then 20 years from now, we'll do the stuff that's a little more expensive. No, the house is on fire. We actually sort of have to do everything now, and particularly this next decade is critical. So I am encouraged that there's a whole swath of electric utility companies that have set very ambitious goals for decarbonizing their systems without being required to. And 80% emission reductions by such and such a year, 100% carbon free by such and such a year. Hold them to that promise, and it's verifiable. You can they will publish their CO2 emissions. I'm also encouraged that worldwide, so many automakers embraced the transition to electric vehicles, and that's before it's mandated. Now we also, of course, have some mandates coming. Again, that's a sign of real action. And there's also an initiative that my think tank is involved in called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. We're encouraging more and more companies to sign up to set real targets to get to net zero emissions in their company's footprint by a future year. And again, this is a verified, scientifically driven program. The last thing I'll mention, back to the subject of offsets, the idea of offsetting a CO2 emission is not a terrible idea. It may be very hard for us to squeeze all of the carbon out of our energy system. We may have to legitimately offset some things that are very hard to decarbonize. For instance, planes. Right now, we don't have good economical ways to fly planes without emitting CO2. So there is a role for offsets, and there's an initiative called the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and they are a set of very serious people, serious companies who are trying to set really binding good rules to make sure that offsets are real, because there is a role for them. So I'll stop there, and again, thank you.
Thanks. It would be great to hear from Kirk next.
Okay, hi. Do I need to turn this on?
Thanks. Now Professor Leif Van Boven.
Okay, I think this is on, yes? Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Now it's definitely on. So my area of expertise is greener than another type of consumption. That's really challenging because those types of heuristics are not necessarily tied to the facts. And so sometimes they can be helpful, but they can also be misleading. And then the third challenge that we face as consumers, and this one is a bit more subtle, but when we take on the responsibility of investigating greenwashing and of investigating the environmental impact of our behaviors, it invites us to take responsibility for solving the problem, for thinking that we can solve the problem of climate change primarily through relatively minor changes in consumer behavior. And that orientation can be a little bit misleading when what we really need are broader level systems changes and changes in policy that would make it much easier for consumers through sort of natural pricing mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms to reduce our overall consumption impact. So really looking forward to the discussion today and adding some insights, hopefully, about both the challenges that we face as consumers and how we can think better about solving some of these problems.
Thank you, Leif. Mary, it'd be great to hear from you.
Good morning. Can you hear okay? Good? Good. Great to be here with you all. And I actually look forward to this discussion as well. You know, my sustainability career has spanned 30 years and crossed the public sector, the government, the private sector, several large global corporations, and now the nonprofit sector. And seeing kind of the journey from different perspectives, I think, has been very fascinating. And frankly, I think folks in roles like mine need to be pragmatic optimists. So seeing kind of the arc of progress. You know, when I joined the US EPA back in 1994, right out of graduate school, the agency hired 100 of us to build the Energy Star brands and to really drive consumer awareness of the need to look for energy efficiency in their purchasing decisions and to work with manufacturers to get them to develop and promote more energy efficient appliances and options for consumers. And you know, it was a great journey, but it's, you know, look where we are today. I think the Energy Star brand is pretty ubiquitous and folks know to kind of think about energy efficiency when making purchasing decisions. So it's been a fascinating journey. And then when I joined Wells Fargo in 2004, It was really at a moment where most focus on sustainability was more focused on environmental health and safety issues with companies. So companies that had to comply with environmental regulations and had environmental safety issues versus a bank that really facilitated capital and facilitated other industries. And so what did sustainability and responsibility mean for an organization like that in 2004? Went from that arc to in 2021, Wells Fargo and frankly most of the large US global financial institutions made net zero commitments of their own. And those net zero commitments reach not only into their own operations, but into their value chains. So commitments tied to who they financed and to their supply chain. So it's been a fascinating journey. Look forward to sharing kind of my views on kind of what has integrity and where to look, look deeper under the hood when companies make sustainability claims.
Thanks, Mary. Jevin, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for taking the time to come listen to us. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I spend most of my waking hours thinking about this issue of misinformation and disinformation and rumors. Over the last 3 years, we've spent most of our time in my center, which is about 50 researchers, postdocs, PhD students, thinking about misinformation when it comes to the pandemic and health issues. But we've been starting to shift more into the climate arena. So this is sort of new for me. So I'm really looking forward to learning more from the panel. But we've been able to apply some of the things that we learned during the pandemic to issues related to climate. And so we study these kinds of issues mostly by collecting massive amounts of publicly available data, mostly from social media platforms, to study the ways in which rumors travel, how they get amplified, how individuals, how organizations sometimes strategically amplify and sometimes non-strategically. But we don't just study these things, we also try to build interventions. And one of my favorite ones that we just recently released, this was developed by one of my colleagues, Mike Caulfield, in our center, that just got deployed by Google, and it relates to how to source information. So if you were to ask a question about greenwashing on Google, one of the most important things we need to do is not just evaluate the content, but evaluate the source. And so now, you might not even have seen it yet, but it's been hit over 6 billion times, but that's still a small number compared to the number of searches that Google gets all the time. But every search you do now, there'll be 3 little vertical dots next to the website that it lists in your query results. And if you click on that, you can then look for the source. You can look about things where that when that website was created, what is the sort of basic data about that source, et cetera. You can do the kinds of things that professional journalists and fact checkers already know how to do, but it makes it that much easier. Now, this isn't a feature that should have taken till 2023 to get into the system, but this is the examples of small little innovative designs and tools that we want to give the public so that they can ask the questions that we'll likely be asking on this session right now. We've been also thinking a lot about the ways in which technology in general, but certainly the chatbot era has kept us very busy over the last 6 months, thinking about the ways in which chatbots and large language models are being used to push good information, but also bad information. These are really bullshitters at scale on the bad side, but also can be a tool that we can use to address some of these big, complicated topics. So that's another topic I'm happy to jump into a little bit more, but I'm relying more on my colleagues to talk about the climate-related issues.
Okay, thanks everyone. The questions are coming in. Just a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, just raise your hand and one of the moderators will come on over and submit them. So I want to ask a question to all of you. Greenwashing is ultimately an issue about communication, right, and information. So I have two questions. The first is, in many ways, all of you have positions in which you're translating that information to a variety of audiences, whether it's academic or whether it's testifying before Congress or whether it's publishing papers, whether it's making sustainability decisions within corporations or NGOs. So I wanted to ask, where do you get the most reliable information yourself? And how do you translate that then, given the various audiences that you interact with? How do you scale that? So the first part is, where do you get your information? I know, Kirk, you've got to do this on the fly very quickly as a reporter.
Does this mean I have to go first?
No. But I'm really curious, right? So where do you go? How do you know it's reliable? And then the second part, which we can get into later, is, okay, then how do you translate it for the various different audiences that you talk with?
Well, I was intrigued to learn about this ... feature, which I think it needs to be probably a little bit more prominent. But
Yes.
if I'm honest, I spend a lot of time talking to people who have never been interviewed before, who have never necessarily made their points publicly before to a large audience, who may not know what NPR is. So I think that they are as genuine, generally speaking, they're as genuine, perhaps not as informed as they may think they are, but they're being as genuine as possible. And then it's up to me and my editor and our librarian staff to help fact check that quickly on the fly. So we have a lot of different tools that we can, push a claim through that's a little bit more scientific than just Googling something, but I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you I was up here sometimes standing in the sagebrush in Nevada Googling something like, did this person just say that? Is that true? And then make sure what you look at is at the very least, linked to some sort of reputable academic institution that has studied this issue, or a governmental organization that is disconnected as much as possible from whoever the current administration is.
I can go just since we're going out of order. One of the unfortunate things about our information system is most of the good information is behind a paywall. So you either are paying that subscription to the better venues. I think NPR is an exception to that. Of course, I do not think, I know it is. But a lot of the great primary literature, the stuff that comes out of this university, a lot of times sits behind a publication paywall. That's changing and has been over the last decade. More and more of that's becoming open access, and it should, because the taxpayers pay for the research that's at this university and most of the research that happens in this country. And so that's one unfortunate thing. So we need to address that. I can talk about that, about some solutions, but there's no simple solution to that. But that's where I get my good information, is most of this information in the primary literature behind these paywalls and in places that I do trust and that have higher journalistic standards, typically require a little extra effort and pay. One of the things that I do to look for more reliable information is I've become a true vociferous lateral reader. And this is something that we talk about when talking to the public about becoming better consumers online. This is based on several studies that came out of Stanford that looked at how people evaluate information and claims and compared that to fact checkers. And you could even ask professors, say, evaluate this claim, and they think if they can evaluate the content, they'll be able to tell whether it's reliable or not. Well, it turns out the best thing you can do is open a new tab and just read open another tab, open another tab. This is what fact checkers do, and that's a way of triangulating information and checking whether that claim that you just heard over dinner is reliable. So this idea of lateral reading, we should become better lateral readers if we want to do that as well. And then in terms of my own other big sources is reputation. I think that does matter. There's ways to measure reputation, but also I depend on my social network, and I think a lot of other people do as well. And that's where things can go awry sometimes, but it's also a lot of times where I get my most reliable information. And in terms of translating this information, that's one of the big challenges in science. I spend a lot of times thinking about science communication. Unfortunately, messages go awry when from university press offices down to the consumer, and we need to do a better job figuring out, well, first, employing more science journalists. I think that would help. We only have, a very, very small number of full-time science writers in the United States, which is a sad story, and I think that's the way we do translation. But just the last report I saw on it was 70-something full-time science journalists. I mean, there's a lot of part-time ones too, but that's a problem, and that's what I rely on for translation is science journalists.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. I think when looking at a company's claims, I would not look at some logo on a package or, some advertising. I think you've really got to dig deeper, go to the website, the reporting section on a corporate website, look for commitments that are really focused on material issues for that company. If they're making a commitment on some topic that's not really relevant to their sector and their industry, I'd be a little suspicious. So make sure they're focused on the issues that are quite relevant to that industry and that sector of the economy. Look for climate commitments that are aligned to the 1.5 degree pathways, as opposed to just some broader climate commitment. Once they've made a big commitment like that, look for interim commitments, 3 to 5 year, 2025 commitments, 2030 commitments, commitments that really start to dig deeper and break apart how they're going to get to 1.5. A lot of people will say companies can make those commitments because none of the executives will be around in 2050 to be accountable for those commitments. So look for those interim steps that they're making. Look for how they're unpacking those commitments across, scope 1, their own operations, scope 2, their energy usage, scope 3, their value chains. So make sure they have commitments that really cut across their entire footprints. Look where they are acknowledging, as we've talked about, some of the harder to reach into areas. How are they working to solve some of those issues that aren't easy to decarbonize today that are relevant to them? What partnerships are they part of? What research are they funding? Where are they putting their dollars to really help solve and develop solutions to issues that are tough to deal with today? They need to show evidence that, that they're really focused on not the low-hanging fruit, but, the tougher to solve issues that aren't going to be solved overnight, that are going to really take time to solve. They need to follow, as we talked about, leading disclosure frameworks. So there's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that they are reporting in a way that's transparent. They're measuring progress over time. They're accountable to their stakeholders, that they're really tracking what they've said they'll do and the progress against those commitments. So there are ways to kind of start to, as I said, lift the hood and see, they've made a big commitment, but what are they really doing to make progress towards that commitment?
Mary, if I may, I would like to insert a comment there. So you've listed a lot of different ways that consumer can sort of, pick apart. Okay, that could take months, right? Before one could say, I'm going to buy this brand of car versus this brand of car. To get under the hood is hard. What do you think, I want to ask this question to both Mary and Leif, what do you think about corporations signing up for certifications like B Corp? Is that a fair, right? The consumer does not have time, right, to do all of this primary research. And as was so well said by Jevin, many of the primary research is behind a paywall. Are these certifications legitimate? Are they helpful shortcuts? And then Leif, a question for you based on your research. Seems like people look a lot to influencers for making decisions, right? So what are the shortcuts here, and are they worthwhile, if I may?
Sure. I wanted to answer your first question first. So I think actually personally I get a lot of my climate news from Kirk, so thank you very much for the service you provide. So I think, again, in keeping with the theme of what are the challenges for consumers, the fact is that most of us do not have the time or ability to really digest original research on climate science, even if we have access to it. Most of us don't have the training, and so we have to some extent, outsource our trust in the validity and accuracy of information that we get from other science communicators. So what we want to think about is how much do we trust in kind of the institution of science as a way of knowing the world, and then how much do we trust in the sources that are conveying that information? And I want to, if I can, just re-emphasize this point about, what was it, lateralization?
Lateral reading, yeah.
Yeah, lateral reading. So as it happens, we've been doing some work in our lab looking at what are the predictors of the degree to which people trust in science and the degree to which they kind of embrace beliefs that that science suggests are true, like the fact that vaccines are effective, or that like elections are legitimate. And one of the things we see is that the number of different sources that people look to for their news is one of the best predictors of their trusting in science and believing in generally accepted facts. So it's not just the quality of a particular source, but rather having multiple sources that seems to really matter. And even in the context, this is a little bit to the side of climate, but in the context of the presidential election, if we looked at who viewed the election as legitimate versus illegitimate as a function of what kind of news they consumed, it's probably not surprising that if you only consume Fox News, you have a more skeptical view of the legitimacy of the election. But it wasn't just consuming Fox News that was so much problematic. It was consuming only Fox News. So if that was the only place you got your information, that was deeply problematic. But if you could spread out your consumption of media, that was much better in terms of kind of recognizing the legitimacy of the election. And that appears to be kind of a general truth. So it's really important for the consumer to have these trustworthy institutions, including the media, including government, including the institution of science, because we simply can't consume and process the direct research. And then that relates to this issue of the Energy Star label or other B Corp issues or other kind of certificates. And that's genuinely helpful for consumers because, again, it's a shortcut, and to the extent it's a good shortcut, that's a good thing for consumers as they use these kind of green heuristics. But then we just sort of back up the question of how do we know which labels, brands, certifications are actually legitimate. And if you start looking around, there are a ton of labels out there. And so we get back to this issue of we don't have kind of a standard agreed upon way of establishing the credibility of these claims. And that's really, I think, what we need as consumers.
I have a brief self-serving remark. If you want good information on these issues, go to the World Resources Institute website. It's all really good stuff. Actually, it really is, but that's very self-serving. I'd like to just make just a little comment on a really important issue that Kirk raised in talking about mining, whether it's lithium, Nevada, or copper in Arizona. And I'll do it just with a brief preface of there's actually a simple way to think about how the heck we reduce CO2 emissions to zero. And it's basically make everything as efficient as possible in how we use energy, number one. Number two, electrify as many end uses as possible throughout the economy. Electric stoves, electric water heaters, electric cars, electric high temperature heat in factories, et cetera, et cetera. Number three, of course, if we're going to electrify everything, we have to produce a lot more electricity, and we have to take the emissions of our power plants to zero. And the fourth thing is carbon capture. We can talk about that, but that's a big thing. And so almost any analysis of how we get there indicates a double, tripling, or even quadrupling of electricity production over the next 30 years because it becomes the absolute, the absolute basic source of energy, as opposed to right now this big mixture of coal and gas and electricity, coal, gas, and oil. So back to the mining issue, we have to realize that we live in a world of trade-offs. And if we're going to produce a lot more electricity, we're going to need a lot more copper because we're going to be running a lot more transmission wires, we're going to be wrapping a lot more generators, et cetera. We're going to need a lot more lithium to power transportation. But also remember, if we do that, we will have fewer coal mines, fewer oil wells, fewer gas wells. There will be benefits to the environment of not digging all that other stuff out of the earth. So with all respect to the people who are opposing mines here or there, and I'm not delegitimizing the issues of the tribes and sacred land, but I just want to think about it more generally. Think about trade-offs. And the other aspect of this is also the system-wide view and the global view. There's a great story in the New York Times in the last couple months about a nickel mine that a company wanted to open in Minnesota. And yeah, they were going to try to be real careful, but there were worries about the environmental impacts. But the reporter did a real good job in saying, you know, what are the big sources of nickel? Well, there's a giant nickel mine and smelter in Russia that produces so much pollution that satellites can see, you know, the smoke streaming out. Indonesia wants to develop nickel deposits under rainforests. They might destroy sections of rainforest to open a nickel mine. So often, I would say there are going to be times when if we mine in the U.S. with our environmental protections, there's going to be less impact than what's going to happen in some other countries that have less environmental protections around mining than we do.
I was only going to add really fast to that, to your question about how difficult it is to get information, even for us, quickly on the front lines. Using the lithium example in Nevada, it's called Thacker Pass on the northern remote part of Nevada. We're often confronted with, this will be the largest lithium mine in the nation. But when we try to ask the question of, how does that fit into the global market? How much lithium is actually necessary for this green energy transition? It's difficult to find a reliable source who is, I'm thinking, and not to say that the University of Nevada does not have reliable sources, but many of them are working quite closely with the lithium industry because it is their job. So when you're confronted with some of that stuff, it's difficult to find the right information, and I think it's our responsibility in the news media to disclose to the public that in fact, in this case, we might not exactly know. We do know that generally speaking, it is probably cleaner than your traditional mine, and it is certainly cleaner and safer mining in North America than in China. Which is where many of these minerals come from now. In other countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, in the case of a cobalt mine that's being restarted in Idaho. So yeah, I think it's our responsibility to, when we don't have the information, to be clear with the public that we actually don't have the information.
That's great. And that leads me to a follow-up question, looping back to you, Mary. You've had the advantage of working in the public and the private sector, working for Wells Fargo, one of the largest, corporations and banks in the world. Can you speak about, and Kirk was mentioning, that there's inherent bias in communication. We are humans. Whoever pays, our wages at the end of the day gets a pretty big vote in what we say. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind speaking about your experience as a sustainability person in both the public and private sector, and what that was like, and whether or not there was pressure to communicate in one context differently than another.
A fair question, but as I said, I tend to be a pragmatic optimist. I think what we're seeing in the evolution of the corporate sustainability space is that management of sustainability is moving from kind of public affairs sustainability teams to being truly embedded across businesses and functions in businesses, and that's a good thing, right? I think a small headquarters team can't really move the needle as quickly, and has to be in some ways pretty opportunistic about what they do, as responsibility for managing these issues really being owned by the businesses and core operational functions of companies. And so I think it's been an evolution. When I started at Wells Fargo, I was employee one, and I was the only employee focused on sustainability. When I left, there were hundreds of employees that had it in their job descriptions to manage these issues. Communication is hard because the issues, as we've just talked about with lithium, are complex, right? And you don't really have the opportunity in a corporate communication setting to have a subtle and nuanced and conversation about a particular topic. You're trying to explain in a transparent way kind of what you're trying to achieve as a company, the progress you've made in those efforts, the challenges you're experiencing in making that progress, how you're trying to work in a collaborative way to advance kind of sustainability outcomes with important stakeholders. But it's a challenging exercise, frankly, to be able to If you think about a financial institution making a 1.5 degree commitment, the large financial institutions bank the economy. And so they're going to move with the economy and move with sectors of the economy. They bank all industries across economies. And so it's a very complex exercise and a complex conversation. And so, that's why I encourage, lifting the hood, looking at the sustainability reports. I think there is no one certification, frankly, that you can rely on when trying to evaluate how a company is managing climate issues or sustainability issues. I think there are kind of rankings, most admired companies, Just Capital list of most just companies. You can use those begin to use those as proxies for how serious companies are about their sustainability and ESG initiatives, environmental, social governance efforts, but there isn't one place to go for this information. I think it is challenging for consumers, and it does require digging a little deeper. And I think companies want to engage their stakeholders. They want to communicate effectively. I think it's just very challenging, frankly.
Does anyone want to add to that point?
I was only going to say quickly, it's my observation in covering a myriad of companies, and I don't just cover mining companies, but I gave that example of the Rio Tinto executive telling me in her conference room in downtown Phoenix that Rio Tinto is part of the clean energy revolution. And like, wow, it's kind of an interesting thing. We put it on the air. But I do think most companies, and I could be being maybe Pollyanna, but most companies are trying to do the right thing, but they're massive organizations, and to write a big apparatus around, I think we were talking about this earlier, is going to take time, and it's not going to happen overnight. Now, whether or not there's urgency to that, but I think it does seem that way anyway, that companies, most of them anyway, are trying to, and perhaps maybe their PR firms are highlighting a little bit too much of that, but in the end, I do sense, at least in my job, a real shift, albeit slow and moving though.
Can I ask you?
Absolutely.
So this is actually for you, Mary. So if we assume that commitments to environmental social governments are genuine, what is being committed to? Like, what is the standard that companies are agreeing to or aspiring to, and how then do we know whether they're meeting those standards?
I think it depends, right? If you look at companies' sustainability reports, there are a number of environmental commitments they're making in terms of renewable energy usage, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in their operations. There's a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments they're making in terms of supporting diverse communities, growing diverse leadership within companies. There are governance commitments they're making, being a more ethical company. How do you measure that? And so I think it's there. If you look at any large, Fortune 100 company's ESG report, there are probably dozens and dozens of commitments they've made across the ESG spectrum. Like I said, you should make sure they're material for that company. I remember taking a class years ago where they talked about a fast food company that had a big promotion around breast cancer reduction. That probably wasn't the most relevant ESG issue for that company, right? So make sure that what they're committing to is related to their business and relevant to their business material. We call it materiality in the sustainability space. And then unpack it. Do they have they quantified it in a way that you can understand? Is there accountability? Is an ESG performance embedded into performance objectives and pay? Increasingly, yes. Executives are being evaluated in how they're advancing ESG initiatives across companies. You can see that in sustainability reports, whether they've done that or not. So I think unfortunately, it takes a little bit of work to understand who has commitments that have substance behind them, and how they're kind of measuring and implementing those commitments.
I want to make sure that we leave time for the 50 or more questions that are being arranged in various ways here in front of me. I'm trying to put these in a variety of different categories. Many folks have submitted questions about consumption. One question is many approaches in terms of greenwashing or advertising, how sustainable your company is, seem to be focused on appearance. And I think we've addressed how a consumer might dig a bit deeper to sort out if that's authentic or not. Another question is, absent a return to a pre-industrial economy, what will be effective? Leaf brought up a great point about this issue being fundamentally related to consumerism, right? How do we deal with consumerism at large in the face of this massive climate crisis?
I'll take a first take, and that is if you look at, many of you are familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. It just concluded its latest assessment of the science, the impacts, and the solutions, the mitigation of climate. And they do have some really, they have probably the most extensive coverage of any of their reports on what they call demand-side options. What can we do by reducing consumption? What can we do by redesigning our cities? Very important. What could we as a globe do by changing our diet and how that affects agricultural emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all good stuff, but I want to offer a caveat. Consumption is perhaps a piece of the puzzle here, but I don't think we're going to solve it by changing the consumption habits of now 8 billion people, many of whom are less wealthy than the people in this room. And I would say the people in this room, and maybe live streaming too, are more likely to drive a hybrid or an all-electric car. They're more likely to bicycle. They're more likely to recycle, and on and on. But when you want to communicate to 8 billion people and what they can do to solve climate change, telling them that you need to reduce your consumption, I don't think it's going to get you too far. You're going to be shifting consumption here or there, again, depending on population. But I just go back to my mantra that I said a minute ago: be efficient, electrify everything, and move to zero carbon electricity generation. If we can push hard on that in the next 30 years, we will have solved about 80% of the problem.
I'll just mention something about which is kind of not as much about consumerism, but is the opportunity for investing. I think one of the trends in financial investing has been green investing, and my wife works in this space, and just like we've talked about, at least on the consumer side at least on the product side, there are very few standards that are set at this point, and it's very difficult to figure out who's sort of actually meeting their own self-set standards or not. But in the process of looking at financials, just because I was interested one night, one of the students that I'm on a PhD advisory committee on noticed that there's other forms of greenwashing, sort of on issues like DEI, for example. A lot of companies will put their financial reports out around DEI issues, and they'll have all sorts of pictures of people representing different parts of the population. And then if you dig into the numbers, you find that they don't at all represent what they represent in their imagery and their visuals and all these sorts of things. So there's other kinds of, I guess, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry about that. We use too many acronyms and jargon in our thing, so thank you for calling me out on that. So we, that's led to looking at this in other respects to see if we can learn something from these other kinds of greenwashing on other kind of social issues.
Go ahead, Mary, please.
To add one thing. We were talking about kind of top-down, kind of what needs to happen. We also need to think about bottom-up, right? We have communities around the world that are just, grasping for economic opportunity. And so to try and impose that you can't do this, you shouldn't do that on communities around the world that are trying to feed their families. We have to think about how we lift up those local communities and indigenous communities, right? This needs to be a solution that is sustainable both economically and environmentally. And so I had the privilege of going down to the Amazon last September, and there are soy and beef is putting pressure on the Amazon. There's no question. But at the same time, local people there want livelihoods. And their livelihoods are beef or soy or agriculture, right? And so we have to think about how we support those communities to have economic development that is sustainable. We can't just force them to do it or make them want to do it. We've got to support that in the right ways.
Did you want to add to that, Leif, please?
Yeah, if I can. So, the first part of my career actually was studying kind of happiness and well-being and how it relates to consumer behavior and consumerism. So I wrote a dissertation on that. I'll try to condense that a little bit here. So one really important thing to understand about kind of consumerism, materialism, at least in our society, in a lot of wealthier societies, one of the biggest predictors of carbon footprints is wealth. I mean, it's just values, intentions aside. When we have more, we consume more, and so we need to bear that in mind, and then not to impose things on other people, but rather think about the decisions we make in our own lives, and essentially where can we really genuinely cut back in the costly things that we consume. I think it is useful to keep in mind a couple of pretty well-established facts. So one is that there is a pretty strong negative relationship between valuing and consuming material goods and status and personal well-being. So to the extent that consumers really value having things and maybe even having more things than other people, that not only is not fulfilling, it actively kind of undermines our sense of well-being. If we look instead at what contributes positively to well-being, acts of altruism, doing good things for other people, fulfills people with a sense of meaning, purpose, positive emotion, serenity, all of the kind of soft well-being terms, that really is sustainable. Building social connections and maintaining social connections. And these are things, doing things for other people, building social connections, those are things that can be done in a very low carbon way. Not always, you could do it expensively, like you don't need to travel around the world to build social connections, but you can think about how can we pursue those actions that are more fulfilling in a way that is really low carbon. There is a great resource that I can't give you the URL or the specific name of it now, but I could provide it later. There's a team at the University of British Columbia of psychologists, consumer behavior researchers that have come up with a set of guidelines that people can follow to make decisions that are both sustainable and are likely to advance well-being. And so thinking about pursuing those kind of strategies, again, to the extent we have the resources that we can do that, is a great way to both enhance well-being while reducing consumerism.
That's a great pivot to a bunch of questions that are coming in, which is that people they acknowledge that getting the information a consumer would need to make the best possible choice, given all of the trade-offs we've just mentioned. It's difficult. It's an enterprise that takes time, and many of that information maybe isn't accessible for one reason or another. So you mentioned guidelines, and many questions are coming in about, okay, should I only shop through the sustainable B Corp brand? Should I, what shortcuts, if any, are going to be helpful? And we've also, Mary mentioned that there is no great shortcut, and that this is a very complex, nuanced space. Leif also followed that with the point of we should perhaps be thinking about these universal guidelines and shortcuts. So where do you all stand on this issue? Just to address this question of consumers need to make decisions quickly. We want the right information. Where do we go? What do we do? Are shortcuts worth trying to develop? And if so, what would those even look like?
Yes. So again, the first question you might want to ask as a consumer is, do I need to consume? So I feel a little bit guilty calling this out, but it's great if Patagonia produces sustainable clothing, but the question is maybe not should we buy this brand versus another, but should we buy anything at all? So that's maybe the first question to ask. There is a great program of research by some behavioral economists at Duke University who've done some work on how you can present consumers with information that is useful for them in everyday consumption context. And they did sort of really a proof of concept study that showed that in just grocery shopping, so in buying sort of consumer packaged goods, food consumer packaged goods, if there was a single metric, kind of like a calorie metric, that was a carbon footprint metric on grocery items, that people would actually make choices where they took that into account and made some internal trade-offs about how much they were willing to pay more to have more kind of climate-friendly products. And so is it something that consumers would use if they had the information? I think there's some good evidence that it is. The question, I think, and the challenge for us is how can we ensure that the information that we would provide to consumers is actually valid and reliable?
I was going to add, I think we're living in a really extraordinary time where full of irony. Like, we have all of this information right in our little laptops that we carry in our pockets, but there's so much information coming in, it's hard to make an informed decision. And there's a whole chunk of the country that's not in this room who may also want to make decisions that are sustainable to them, but this is a very polarized environment, and half of the country right now is not necessarily having this same conversation. So I think I keep saying it's ironic that there's so much information in front of us, but I get confronted constantly, even this morning, with very genuine, thank you so much for what you do. I only get my news from NPR. And it's sort of like, well, great, but you should also be looking at other things and seeing what other people are saying and other information out there, because if you're just getting it from one source, and I'm not saying everybody's doing that, but I do get that a lot, it's kind of a troubling time. So I think we also need to tackle how to better equip society with the tools that they can figure out how to make informed decisions that make sense to them. And I'm not sure how we do that, and it's not my job in the news media to do that.
And the only thing I'd add is I love that movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? We can't tackle it all as individuals. So think about kind of your own lifestyles, the issues that are most important to you, and where that intersects with your engagement in the corporate space. So is it agricultural issues you care about? Is it energy issues you care about? Is it water issues you care about? Like, just think about, what issues are most important to you, and then that's where you can dig deeper, right? Those are, is it your banking system? Do you care about who you're banking with? Like, think about, just try to funnel down to what's most important to you and where that intersects in the corporate space or the sustainability space, and that's where you spend your time, because you're not going to kind of boil the ocean right now. You've got to really focus on what's relevant to you, what's important to you, and where you want to spend your time and energy.
We have just a few minutes. I don't know that we'll be able to fully answer this question, but it is from a student, so I wanted to make sure I read it. With Tesla Plaid, electric Hummers, Chevy Silverados, F-150 pickup, Ford Lightning, Rolls-Royce Spectres, and many other heavy, inefficient EVs, is there any hope?
Well, this relates to the consumer question too, but one of the best questions I got from a colleague of mine who studies this pretty consistently throughout his career. He said, you want to know what the most efficient car that you should, most efficient green car that you can buy? It's your current car, and it's not the newest, greatest Tesla. It's not anything else. But he's done all this analysis showing the cost, even if it would take sometimes multiple decades to catch up, given the cost. So that's a question that keeps ringing in my mind as I think about, because I'm looking to get an electric car, but I'm like, Well, he did say this is the most electric car, which is a beat-up Nissan, so is what I have, so. Yeah.
I think there's some hope. I mean, I think it's also on the news media ourselves to maybe focus a little bit more on shining a light on things that are working. We have a tendency, particularly since Trump in 2016, to be focused on every single controversy all the time. And I think we're running the risk of alienating young people, in particular students, of just being like, well, there's no hope. But there are countless examples and there are countless good stories right in your backyard that don't involve greenwashing, that are legitimate community projects that are making a difference. And I think it's probably the onus is in some respects on us to do a better job at shining the light on those types of stories. This morning it was pointed out to me right behind us in Longmont is a solar farm that we've covered on NPR that has, it's literally a solar farm. It has solar panels generating electricity, and there's vegetables being grown underneath the solar panels. So there are a lot of good news examples out there, so I think it's on us to do a better job at highlighting those as well.
That's a great point. We have about 30 seconds left. If anyone would like to give us a final parting soundbite.
No pressure.
I just want to echo what Kirk said. Is the glass is always half empty and half full, and we're developing the technologies, we're developing the public awareness, and we can do this if we now marshal the political will, and perhaps even more important than our consumption decisions is our voting decisions, and paying attention not only to the national races but the state and the local races, and putting people in our elected offices who will then make more and better collective decisions to steer where we're going.
Yeah. With that, I want to end by thanking all of our terrific panelists and to thank the audience for your engaging questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all 50 of them. Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.